A stranger's lie cost me 12 years. He finally told the truth. I was convicted of arson and manslaughter based on the testimony of a man I had never met before the day he stood up in court and pointed at me. That's the part of this story people struggle with most. Not that the system got it wrong, but that it got it wrong because of a person with no connection to me at all, who had every reason in the world to lie, and did. My name is Isaiah Boone. I'm 42 now. 14 years ago, I was 28, working as a warehouse supervisor, living a quiet life in a rented duplex with my younger brother, Marcus, while we both saved up to move somewhere better. Neither of us had much. We had each other, mostly, and a plan. A fire broke out at a small storage facility across town one night, and a night security guard died in it. I had no connection to that building. I'd never worked there, never had business there, didn't know anyone who worked there. But 3 weeks into the investigation, a man named Curtis Dale came forward to detectives claiming he'd shared a jail cell briefly with me on an unrelated minor charge months earlier, and that I had confessed to setting the fire during that time. I had, in fact, spent 2 nights in county lockup around that time on a disorderly conduct charge that got dropped almost immediately. I had shared a cell with several people during those 2 nights. I did not remember Curtis Dale specifically, and I certainly never confessed to a crime I hadn't committed to a stranger in a jail cell for no reason at all. But jailhouse informant testimony has a strange power in a courtroom. It sounds specific. It sounds like it couldn't possibly be invented. Juries tend to trust it more than the circumstances usually warrant. What I didn't know then and wouldn't learn until years later was that Curtis Dale was facing his own serious charges at the time he came forward. A drug trafficking case that could have put him away for 15 years. 3 weeks after his testimony helped convict me, his own charges were quietly reduced to a plea deal resulting in 18 months. Nobody explained that connection to the jury. Nobody was required to. My public defender, a decent man named Walter Higgs, who was managing far too many cases at once, argued that there was no physical evidence tying me to the scene, no motive. No witness placing me anywhere near that building the night of the fire. It didn't matter enough. Curtis Dale's testimony, delivered with what the prosecutor called compelling specificity, was enough to convict me of manslaughter and arson. I was sentenced to 22 years. My brother Marcus was 24 when I went in. He was the only person who never once wavered. He visited every single month for 14 years, no matter how far he had to drive after we lost the duplex, and he moved twice for cheaper rent. He wrote to organizations that handle wrongful conviction cases every single year, sometimes multiple times a year, often getting form letter rejections explaining that their caseload was full or that my case didn't currently meet their review criteria. I want to be honest about what those years did to me, because I think people imagine wrongful conviction as a story that simply resolves once the truth comes out, and it doesn't work that way, even when it does eventually resolve. I spent years in a particular kind of rage that had nowhere to go because the person responsible for my situation wasn't someone I could confront. He was a stranger who had simply needed a bargaining chip and found me convenient. Year 8 is when a legal aid organization focused on wrongful convictions finally took Marcus's letter seriously enough to review my file. A young attorney named Farah Nasser was assigned to my case. She told me during our first meeting something Deborah-like in its bluntness. "I'm not promising you anything," she said. "I'm promising you I'll actually look." Farah's team spent nearly 3 years working the case in the background of dozens of others they were also handling. What eventually cracked it open wasn't new physical evidence. There had never been physical evidence connecting me to the fire in the first place. It was a pattern. Farah's team discovered that Curtis Dale had provided similar jailhouse informant testimony in at least 2 other cases over the following decade, both times shortly before his own pending charges were quietly reduced. In one of those other cases, the conviction had already been overturned years earlier on the same grounds, an informant deal that had never been properly disclosed to the defense. Farah tracked down Curtis Dale himself, now in his late 50s, living a quiet, unremarkable life 2 states away. She told me she expected him to refuse to talk or to deny everything outright, the way people usually do once truth threatens to cost them something. Instead, she said he seemed almost relieved when she explained why she was there. He gave a sworn statement admitting that he had never actually shared a cell with me long enough to have any real conversation, that a detective on the original case had approached him directly, described details of the fire to him in advance, and offered to speak to the prosecutor on his behalf in exchange for testimony. He said he told himself for years that it hadn't really hurt anyone, because he assumed, incorrectly, that I must have done something to deserve suspicion in the first place, or that the system would eventually sort it out on its own if I hadn't. I convinced myself it wasn't really a lie, he said, according to Farah's notes from that meeting. It was just easier to believe that than to think about what I'd actually done. The detective who had reportedly coached him had since retired and, when questioned, denied any wrongdoing, though the pattern across multiple cases eventually became difficult for prosecutors to explain away. My conviction was formally vacated 11 years and 7 months after I was sentenced. I was released on a Tuesday in October, a detail I remember specifically because Marcus told me later he'd chosen to take that exact day off work months in advance, certain it would eventually be the day, long before anyone had confirmed a date. Walking out of that facility, I remember the strange sensation of a world that had kept moving in my absence in ways too large to fully absorb all at once. Phones that looked nothing like the one I'd had before I went in. A city skyline with buildings I didn't recognize. Marcus himself looking like an older, steadier version of the 24-year-old I'd left behind. I've received compensation through the state's wrongful conviction statute, though no amount of money restores 12 years, and I've stopped expecting it to. I run a small logistics consulting business now with Marcus, something we built together once I was able to work again. I still struggle with trust in ways I don't think will ever fully resolve. I still occasionally wake up disoriented in my own bed, needing several seconds to remember where I actually am. I've never spoken to Curtis Dale directly. Farah told me he expressed something like remorse in his statement, and I believe that's probably true. But remorse and consequence are two very different things, and I've made peace with the fact that his life moved forward relatively unaffected for over a decade, while mine did not. What I understand now, in a way I didn't before any of this happened, is that the system doesn't always require someone to be malicious for it to fail catastrophically. Sometimes it only requires someone in a position of desperation, someone else in a position of convenience, and enough time passing that both of those things simply calcify into an outcome nobody bothers to double-check. If this story affected you, tell me in the comments, do you think jailhouse informant testimony should even be allowed in courtrooms without independent evidence? Subscribe for more true stories like this one.